It seemed a meaningless distinction to Szeth, but it was deeply steeped in the culture.
Welcome to The Storming Journey, a sacred text reading of The Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. This podcast may contain spoilers for The Stormlight Archive through Wind and Truth.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Storming Journey. I'm Elle, and I will be the Ardent for today's episode as we cover Interludes 4 through 6 with Rysn, Axies, and Szeth from The Way of Kings.
And I'm Liz. I'll be your Worldsinger for today.
And I'm Adam, and I'll be the Veristitalian for today.
Okay, so we are looking at these interludes through the theme of cultural differences. So I decided to share a story about when a cultural difference caught me up. Back when my youngest child first started going to preschool, and I was like, oh, I can finally breathe as a stay-at-home mom. I have some time to myself. What am I going to do with it? I'm going to start writing again. So I decided, as you do when you live in Seattle, that you go and write in a Starbucks. This is a thing, right? Because there's a million Starbucks. It's easy to get to one. And easy to start that routine where you're in a new place and this is where you do your writing. As a Latter-day Saint, of course, I don't order coffee. But I love Starbucks hot chocolate. It's great. And so I would go to Starbucks, order a hot chocolate, sit down, write fiction on my laptop. But randomly, I could not figure out why. Some weeks my hot chocolate would taste really terrible and burnt. And I was like, what is going on here? Why can't these Starbucks be consistent from place to place? Isn't that the point of a Starbucks? And it took me about 6 months to figure out that the Starbucks people were being so kind to me and giving me a free shot of espresso in my hot chocolate because they assumed that was what I wanted. And I didn't think I had to specify, no, I don't want coffee in my hot chocolate because in my culture, that's ridiculous. Why would you put coffee in hot chocolate? And so it took me a long time to figure out and of going to counters and being like, this hot chocolate is terrible. Can you remake it? Until I figured out that I needed to say, do not put espresso in my hot chocolate. I do not want any coffee. Because there was just a cultural miscommunication there. So that's my story about a cultural difference.
I have to ask, Liz, did you have, on those days when the espresso shot was added, did you have really great creative days?
Honestly, I don't get a lot of effects from caffeine, so I didn't really notice the difference. I'm not one of those people who has a huge impact from caffeine. I have never been a caffeine drinker, even with soda, which we can talk about the whole Mormons and caffeine thing, but we don't need to go into that now.
Consider that one of the blessings. Oh, that God gifted you. All right, so for our Storm's Eye view, welcome to Shinovar, Rysn, our brave, intrepid merchant's apprentice, where you meet the Shin, whose interactions with your Bapsk Vistim are odd, ingratiating, and different. At least, in a land of grass and soil, you walk away with some chickens. Welcome to Erie, Axies, our spring collector, where you wake up hungover having destroyed a temple, but at least you discovered potentially inebriation spren or perhaps ale spren. For dressing before walking out into public, you get a treat of seeing Kusikesh, the protector. But you also get to go to jail for having your body out and nude in front of all the other people. And welcome back to Bavland, Szeth, where you, yet again, must murder and discover a new master, one who knows your true potential.
Great summary of 3 very different episodes. I think that's a fun way to do it. I like working with the interludes in terms of coming up with a theme because they feel like very different things when you first look at them. And so trying to find something that comes out of all 3 of the interludes is just something fun. And the thing that I noticed is that all of them are reacting to cultural differences in their environment. So Rysn is in Shinovar, and not only is the culture of the people very different, but like the physical land is very different. Axies, of course, always travels to lots of different cultures as part of his adventuring, but there's still some cultural differences that he has to cope with and deal with and navigate. And then Szeth is more, it's less about Badlands specifically and more about Alethi culture versus Shin culture, and his ongoing process of trying to figure out what's okay to be, or not, trying to figure out the differences between heresies in Shinovar and heresies in foreign countries. So I wanted to talk about like how their reactions to cultural differences tell us about their character, because I think the way that we react to new things is very informative. And then kind of like how we react to cultural differences. And of course, now that will be informing how our character is, but like a broader exploration of reacting to cultural differences, and especially with Szeth, the cultural differences being rooted in a religious approach. So what kind of things did you guys see as you were reading with this theme?
I think for me, there were two big things that I think are going to come up probably throughout our conversation today. But one was the attention to clothing that Brandon gives whenever he's trying to evoke culture in his text. Like he emphasizes the difference of Vistim's clothing to Rysn's clothing, and Rysn's like, oh, Vistim uses the old clothing, I use the new clothing. But he also uses the clothing to like show cultural, I don't want to say quite appropriation, but like cultural interactions, right? Like Rysn wears a Vorin glove, which is like showing how that culture within the Vorin religion is spread throughout not just like borders and nationalities, but throughout these multiple nationalities that have deep interaction with each other. So like he's showing cultural interaction and cultural like drift between different things in a really unique way there when it comes to the clothing. And the other thing that I think that fascinated me a lot was the relationship of culture to land. This is one of the larger conversations if you're like in like an eco-fascist space or things like that. But like this idea that the land itself is connected to the culture and affects the culture, but also the culture like affecting the land and the relationship with that. So in the Shin, right, you see they have a different culture because they're walking on soil and grass, or the Erie, right, and their new land and their relationship to spread in a specific way, or things like that. And it's like connection to land and land as a culture in and of itself, I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, specifically on that, there was a cold open quote that I almost chose and I didn't use, but Rysn says how strange, she thought, perhaps living in this place has affected their mind because of how very different, lacking Spren, the Shinovar area is. And she directly makes that tie of the way that Shinovar is affects the culture of Shin in a derogatory way in her perspective.
I also think it's interesting to see the contrast between Rysn and Vistim's approaches to the Shin, right? Vistim knows more about the Shin and he's more respectful to them, but he's still got some weird assumptions going on here. Specifically, if we look at when he's explaining to Rysn about the difference between the ones who subtract and the ones who add, right? And he assumes that all of the soldiers are controlled by little stones that signify ownership, when really that's just a result of his experience with Szeth in particular, right? That like, oh, he bought this guy who had a stone that like determined who could control him. And so he assumes all the soldiers are like that. And he kind of gets corrected that, no, we don't have a lot of truthless. These guys aren't the same as truthless. And so even though Vistim understands how to negotiate with the Shin people by undervaluing his goods and bringing metal that was soul cast, he knows lots of things about the culture, but he still gets things wrong. Whereas Rysn, she's getting everything wrong, and she's assuming that she's superior to them. So, like, they're still both getting things wrong, but I feel like there's a qualitative difference between the way Rysn is getting things wrong and the way Vistim is getting things wrong. He's at least trying.
Right. I mean, we were talking about this a little bit before we started, but this is kind of how I think about the way that people approach, like when other Mormon academics or scholars approach Mormon topics or Mormon themes. I don't mind when people get things wrong. There was a podcast who was talking about Brian Johnson, the guy who wants to live forever, and how his idea of longevity is rooted in his Mormonism because I think the gist was like he is worried about being married to his wife forever or something like that. It was like related to his marriage in a interesting way. But like I was like, you got the idea. I think it needs a little bit of correction. There is definitely ideas of longevity in Mormonism, and my friend Blaine has done more with that. But like, there are other scholars or other academics who go on podcasts, and the way they talk about Mormonism immediately feels dismissive and not wanting to actually engage with how the culture interacts with whatever the other topic is. And so it's like, well, what I know about Mormonism is that they are X, Y, or Z. So that obviously means that that's how they're reacting and why they're doing this in reaction. And I think it's like the stim is curious and willing to learn and open-minded. And Rysn is like, I know what I know. I don't need to know more to draw my conclusions. And I seem like a young version of myself in Rysn, and like I don't love admitting that, but like I am glad that I have changed from young Rysn.
And I think we all go through that. Like I assume Vistim was like that as well. Like it took him a long time, I would guess, to learn the things that he's learned. He's traded with them over a long period and learned what they're like. And we see Rysn kind of growing in that direction at the very end of the chapter when he's like, okay, what did you learn? And she makes this analogy to a culture she does understand, right? She says that the Shin treat being humble like the Herdazians treat boasting. So she's like, oh, okay, I can see how this is a way to be and not just like they've gone crazy because they live in this weird place with soil and lazy grass. But like, oh, this is just another version of human nature. It's the same way that Herdazians treat boasting. They're doing kind of like humble bragging, almost like the opposite. We're going to show like how worthless our stuff is instead of how great we are. But it's the same human impulse. And so recognizing the underlying humanity underneath the cultural trappings.
Yeah, and the academic study that reminds me of Jan Chips, who was a historian of Mormonism, who was a non-Mormon, who like built her career around like writing about Mormon history and learning about it, but she did like a lot of the research on it and was able to be a very critical eye and a very fierce eye, right? And saying those in like a very positive way, right? Where she was able to be very concise about what she's saying and very like informed about what she's saying, but she's not saying it from a internal to the community way, which I think is interesting to pull that in to think about this relationship of culture and how Mormonism in general like relates to cultures itself. Like I love this comparison of Vistim and Rysn, and we don't get the perspective of the farmer, who I think is the big farmer for Szeth from book 5, right? Who like sent him off to that. I think that's probably who it is in some forward connections. We get a little bit of him in like the latter book, but we don't get like his perspective. And it makes me think a little bit about this event that happened a few years ago when an academic tried to write he wrote a book called Make Yourselves Gods. His name's Peter Coviello, and he's outside Mormonism, and he wrote this like queer theory approach to Mormonism. And in dialogue, there was a review from Joanna Brooks, who is internal to Mormonism scholar, and her review was basically like, there's this outsider here and he's talking about us and he doesn't go here, pretty much. And it makes me think, like thinking through these chapters and thinking through cultural difference and how there's a difference of maturity between Rysn and Vistim, how it's how people outside a culture treat a culture, but it's also how people internal to a culture react to those outside. So the one who adds, the farmer who's coming to meet with Vistim, he's in some ways an envoy, a herald, not a herald, that's a terrible word to use here. He's a representative of his culture as he's bringing it to Vistim. And Vistim's a representative, we don't get this as much in the interlude, but he's a representative of Thaylen culture, right? And we get that moment when they talk about the other merchants who come to Shin and who always just want horses or always want certain things. And the farmer notices that that's a little different of Vistim. And it's like, it's not always about like the people coming into the culture, but it's also the people who are within the culture reacting to those around them that can create cultural struggle and cultural strife, or cultural interaction and cultural like learning from each other, which I think is really brought out well in these interludes when you're thinking through this idea of cultural difference.
I think we see that really well in the Szeth interlude, right? Where he's starting to realize, okay, I have this attitude that it's profane to walk on stone, but like, how could these people in the East not walk on stone? They don't really have a choice. And so he starts to see like, oh, from my internal perspective, this was the way it always was, but it's because of the landscape that I'm in that I see things that way. He starts to see, oh, can I see things differently? Can I understand where other people are coming from, even if maybe he's not ready at this point to let go of it? He still sees from his own perspective, but he starts to see, oh, you're making sense.
That's one of the like blessings of the interludes, right? Is we're not stuck in the Vorin point of view anymore. We're given other ones. And so it helps us to not just become ingratiated with the Kholinar approach, right? We don't just become like, because whenever you read a book, right, you're going to usually be on the protagonist's side. Even if the protagonist is like super dark and evil, you're usually like there with them in their brain, you understand them. And the interludes give us that chance to really question what's happening on the Shattered Plains and question the logics, even if like for the entire part before we've been supportive of whoever the viewpoint character is. The interludes give us a chance to say, should we be supportive of that, or should we see Roshar as this more complex system of people who aren't just trying to get revenge for a king, or aren't just trying to, you know, unite everyone into this joint like a unified approach to their problems, right? There are other things happening. And I think that's always important to be reminded of, because we have such a bigger world than our own little circle, right?
I have been re-listening to Sanderson books. I was like on a brief hiatus, I think because of the podcast. I was like, well, I can't listen to the rest of the Stormlight archive because I'm in the middle of one of the Stormlight archive books. And then I jumped. But so I was re-listening to Dawnchar, which there are spoilers for, because that counts as the first half of the Stormlight archive, in my opinion. And Rysn is a viewpoint character in that section. And this is years after the Shinovar visit. And she's interacting with Nickley, her assistant, who turns out to be one of the Sleepless. And she's like teaching him about cultural differences. She's talking about like, how do you interact with the sailors? How do you interact with someone who how are the sailors interacting with someone who has disabilities? What does that mean? Nickley's learning how to interact with someone with a disability. And he's also like, I have cultural differences that other people are uncomfortable with. And it shows the way that Rysn talks about these things shows a growth of character of being more open and less judgmental. That like was a huge contrast to like reading this in preparation for the episode of a girl who did not have enough experience to know any different. And like Vistim was giving her experiences, but you know, she's a teenager. Like teenagers are like this. Like if they don't have an opportunity to like see other perspectives, their assumptions are going to be that their perspectives are the right ones. And I think Vistim did a good job in helping her to grow, but I also think she did a lot of good like internal work to like be more okay with cultural difference.
I think the contrast between Rysn and Vistim also shows us that there's differences within a culture as well as differences between cultures, right? We have Rysn saying, oh, I only wear this glove because it would make Vistim uncomfortable if I didn't. And I don't really care about Vorin modesty, but like the older generation do. And then we see the same thing with like, we get to meet some Shin who are not crazy murderers, which is like very interesting. And we get hints here that like Szeth is not the ideal representative of Shin culture. Like maybe he believes things a little more intensely than many of the people in Shinovar do. And like we hear the farmer kind of distance himself from like I hope we don't get another one like Szeth anytime soon because like he caused us problems. And so we get that ability to portray a culture as multidimensional instead of being like, oh, well, all Herdazians are like the Lopen. All Thalens are Rysn. We have more than one perspective and they differ and disagree. And that makes it feel so much richer because that's how real cultures are. It's like difficult to say what Mormons are like because there are many, many Mormons and there are like threads that are the same, but we're not all the same. We don't all agree on everything, even culturally.
And it's so important in there to remember age is also a difference between them, right? Age and experience, not just like cultural generations. And I think a lot in a Mormon connection there, right? Mormonism is very much led by a gerontocracy. It's led by men who are very up there in age, right? I mean, President Oaks is in his 90s, is that correct? Something like that. And President Eyring's also in his 90s, and those are like the top two people who would, President Eyring, like I think the next one who would take over the church after Oaks may pass away. But like, I think it's important to remember that when you're thinking about Mormonism, thinking about the approach to it, right? Because the Gen Alpha of Mormonism is very different than the 90-year-old president who grew up throughout the 20th century, right? I was doing this one thing where I was looking at when all the presidents of the church were born, and Mormonism didn't get a president of the church who was born in the 20th century until the end of the 20th century, which I think is always so fascinating. But at the same time, like it reminds you how those cultural differences need to be respected in many ways. Because I think in Rysn's interlude, especially, we see that inability to approach and that we see that judgmentalness. We see those negative aspects of her. And then because we see those negatives, we get the positive of wisdom, we get the positive of the age of generation, we get the positive of maturity. And what that brings to an experience, right, is something where she's able to learn all these things. And at the same time, going down into Dawn Shard, going down into later interludes, we see Rysn is not just Vistim, like carbon copied, right? She's very different. Like, I don't think Vistim would have jumped off that island coming up in a future interlude, right? Whereas Rysn does. And it's like really interesting to see those cultural differences and those generational cultural differences as well, because it's not just like the society of the culture, it's also that generational gap of culture.
I think Axies is kind of like an interesting like contrast to both Szeth and Rysn, where he's not reconciling like his own personality or his own like personal issues with the culture he's in. It's very much that of an observer of, I'm observing that these things are here. I'm going to be following them because that's the respectful thing to do and the way to like not get in trouble in a culture. And like he's been alive for a while, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the quote at the end of the chapter where he says, at this rate, it might only take a few more centuries to complete his research. So he's got that longer perspective. Like, talk about a gerontocracy here, like the Aemeans. They're around for a long time. And so they have a different perspective on the cultures of Roshar. And they don't get as offended, it feels like, because they're like, it'll probably change in another century or so. It's just the way it is now.
Like, even, so the Saya Aemeans are the ones that are blue. And then we have the other Aemeans who are the sleepless, who again come up in Dawn Shard. And there's again that like generational difference that you talked about of like Nickley is one of the youngest sleepless hordes versus the older sleepless hordes. And like his approach and the younger approach is different and is beneficial because he's like, I can see that like we do need to change in a way that like his youth becomes a benefit. Whereas like with Rysn here, we kind of, the youth feels more like a detriment. Like it feels like inexperience rather than like formation changing. And I think that like that's because we get this brief thing with Rysn in a culture she's unfamiliar with. And I think especially like teenagers do have opinions that should and can be listened to more. And like I think we often overlook how valuable in society like children are. I learned about this study that was talking about how hand dryers in bathrooms are louder for children than for adults. And it was written by a young girl with the help of her parents, where they went and did a bunch of tests of hand dryers, both at the child level and at the adult level. And the child level, it was at levels that are unsafe to hear. And like, not only that, the paper mentions, but like also a child's auditory experience is very different than an adult's auditory experience, regardless of whether it was at an unsafe level. And it was like the girl's perspective, because of her age, was what led to this research. It wasn't just, that was an important component of it. So just like something I wanted to keep in mind as we're thinking about like the cultural age differences, Rysn does feel immature, but that immaturity doesn't necessarily mean don't listen to her.
And I think that all wraps up really nicely at the end of the Rysn interlude when Vistim makes her take the grass, right? Her pet stupid grass. And she's like, why am I doing this? And he says, okay, you gotta keep this grass around until you stop thinking it's odd, right? And she's like, why do that? And Vistim's response is, because it will make you a better merchant. And I think we can apply that to our exposure to cultural differences in general, and that can include generational differences. The more time we spend around other people who think differently, the better we become at whatever we've chosen to be, because we learn what the alternatives are, and our own decisions about how we're going to approach our job or our role, our place in society, become choices that we've made instead of defaults. We come to see that it could be done differently, and I'm selecting this way because I prefer it, but that doesn't mean it's better than anyone else. It changes the way you approach who you are. I think it applies not just to merchants who are traveling between cultures, but to everyone. The more we know about other people's cultures, the better we are. And which is why I, think it's a good thing for non-Mormons to learn about how Mormons think, because that's just another part of the diversity of our culture, right? Like, the more we understand how other people think, the more we can appreciate that.
Food is in here, right? And it is so like different. Whereas like if Rysn's interlude is about like culture coming into each other, Axies is about cultural observation, because he doesn't want to engage in the irreality, right? He doesn't want to like change them per se. He doesn't want to trade with them. He just wants to be there because certain things are happening in Erie. And I think he notices, like, I wrote down a note that like the chapter mentions very particular things about a lot of the irreality and how they are particular about things, which like comes from them perhaps not being a part of Roshar entirely, not being a part of like this ecosystem that like Axies is perhaps a part of and things like that. But I think like in the three interludes, we get a cultural interaction between the merchants. We get a cultural observation with Axies, and then we get a cultural internal change with Szeth, right? Where he's coming to his own and coming to conclusions on his own because he's forced to live in the culture, not just interact with it, not just bring it like to the border and trade across it, but he's actually like ingratiated in Warren culture at that time because he has to live in that space, because he cannot return to his former culture, because he has to walk on stone. And so he has to become a little bit more familiar with it. And so we see in the three different interludes, like different ways to, I don't want to say bridge differences, but to interact with them, right? And to learn from them and to develop as like an individual human being and in communion with so many communities around us, right? And in very positive ways as well. Like whenever I think about cultural difference, I always think about the academic conversations around cultural appropriation, right? Which is when you take a culture and you like bring it into your own and you like claim it for different things. And I've always been a little bit not fully convinced on all those arguments, because culture is always about like interactions between it. And I understand it's like a lot more complex than how I've just given as a brief aside to it. But I think in these interludes, we get a good representation of ways to approach culture that is respectful and is not perfect, but also just a good roadmap if you're wanting to learn, wanting to grow, and wanting to be in the community that we call Earth.
I was thinking about how there are certain religious buildings that especially if you're a woman, you have to be wearing certain clothes. And oftentimes they will ask that you like wear a veil to like enter the building or to be in the building. And a lot of them like have veils there so you don't have to bring one. So they're encouraging you to visit, but they're asking you while you are there to respect their space and to abide by what standards that they have within their space. And I think, like, for someone to go there and to, in good faith, engage with that, like, I think that's a really good way to say, we want you here. And so we do ask you follow these rules, but we want to see you here so you can learn from us and you can understand us better, instead of like making a break of we're going to be weird over here, but you don't get to understand our kind of weird because we don't trust you to follow our rules. And I think like with the farmer in Shinovar, he's willing to work with the stim and say, here are our cultural like restrictions. Like, we need metal that hasn't been mined. Is that like, can you work within that? And it's like, it's a give and take of, we want to respect what you do, and so that we can also like be tall, like we can be respected back, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that maps really well onto like also like how Latter-day Saints treat the temple and the relationship of like the sacredness and secretness of things happening in the temple in relation to people trying to understand about Mormonism. And it makes me think about how like the Shin aren't sharing everything with Vista, and they're not sharing the honor blades or the fact that they have the honor blades, right? So there are things that like even within these cultures, there's spaces where you don't enter or you can't enter or you have no capability of respecting it fully, right? And so they keep it secret, they keep it sacred in different ways. And it makes me, again, think of like the Mormon temple or different spaces that a culture will cut off from other people, because in order to understand and respect it, you have to understand it and you have to grow in that understanding and that respect of it, which I think maps well to that. Like all these cultures you're not learning everything about them. You're not understanding everything about them. You're actually failing at understanding most about them if we're thinking about the Rysn chapter. But at the same time, you don't have to know everything about a culture, because it's impossible if you didn't grow up in it.
And I think like what I was mentioning at the beginning, it's the way that you approach your lack of understanding that really changes how people in that culture react to you. Like if you are trying to say, I want to take on elements of this closed practice, this idea of no one else is supposed to have access to this without being invited by members of the community, like you were talking about, Adam. Like if you are outside that culture and saying, well, I want to use that in my own life, then that feels like cultural appropriation because you haven't been invited into this circle. Or if you're like unwilling, if you're saying, well, you won't give me access to like the temple or temple ceremonies or whatever, Mormonism, then I don't even want to engage with you because you won't tell me about that. That's not something that then Mormons will be increasingly like interested in interacting with you about. They're not going to teach you more that they could have because you're making a hostile environment that doesn't feel respectful of the situation. And like Rysn in a bad way, like a bad version of Rysn or a worse version of Rysn would continue to go the route of like, don't respect your choices and like made that more hostile. But she chooses to go the route of, I'm going to try to learn and try to be more respectful down the line, which I think is a healthier approach to like being a community member. So today for our sacred reading method, I want to bring back the method that Adam used in our last interlude section of sacred imagination, because I think that's kind of a fun, it's our like vacation method. It feels like a little bit we're seeing different parts of Roshar. So we're going to have 3 different sections from each of the different locations. You're welcome to close your eyes and imagine these things while I read them, or you can keep your eyes open as you want. But I want you to imagine yourself being here, and then as part of this method, seeing what more we can draw from these passages and these experiences in the practice of imagining ourselves there. So for the Rysn interlude in Shinovar, the odd grass of the Shin lands waved in the wind, stubbornly refusing to withdraw even at the strongest of gusts. In the distance rose the white peaks of the misted mountains, sheltering Shinovar. The plain around her was dotted with strange, straight-trunked trees with stiff skeletal branches full of leaves that didn't withdraw in the wind.
The beginning of that reminded me a lot of, honestly, how it feels to live in Utah, because you have this, like, bowl of mountains. If you're living on the Wasatch Front, right? Other parts of Utah are different. But if you're living in the Wasatch Front where Salt Lake and Provo are, you're surrounded in this bowl of mountains, and you do feel very, like, sheltered by the mountains. So I feel like that feeling is there with Shinovar as well. But then the trees part at the end reminds me of, I don't know if I've shared this story before, but when I went to college, I had a roommate who was from the Pacific Northwest, and she was like, oh, there's no trees here in Utah. And I'm like, there's trees right there. But then when I moved to Seattle, I was like, oh, I see what you mean. There are no trees in Utah. You are correct. And so just like the difference between what Rysn thinks of as trees and like trees in Shinovar that like have leaves and branches, and to her they're skeletal instead of the way we would think of them as like lush and green and inviting and peaceful. She's like, these are dead, and that's kind of weird and haunting.
The funny thing about that conversation with your roommate is I had the exact same conversation with my husband regarding, like, Utah has no trees. I'm from Minnesota. And he's like, what do you mean? We have trees. And then we went out to Ohio, and he's like, oh, yes. Okay, I see what you mean. There are trees.
I always call mountains out in the East Hills, even if they're like an actual mountain, because I'm like, no, these are not the Rockies. I'm sorry. For me, for that section, I keep thinking about the stubbornly refusing to withdraw, how the grass like has agency in some ways in that, or has action at least, right? They're stubbornly refusing, and it just makes me think about the cognitive dissonance between Shinovar and the rest of Roshar, and how we as readers also have to enter into a cognitive dissonance, because we're so used to seeing something as green, as alive, as the pixie fairy forest, if it's all green and lush. But for Rysn here, the living things are the plants in the more stormy side of Roshar, right? That can actually like move and can like go back into the rocks and come out of the rocks, the rock buds, right? Or the creatures that have adapted to that. And I think that's interesting to think about, because like we would think of like those lands as being more desolate, right? The rocky terrain on the other side of Roshar. But for Rysn, it's flipped, where it's like the lush grass it's not alive and active. There's also no sprint, so that doesn't help. But then the more desolate stuff is the alive and active in her approach. And this makes me think through like our relationship again to that I brought up at the beginning of like that relationship to land, and how much that affects us in our approaches to our culture, and how much it affects our relationship to our culture and our relationship to like what we grew up with and how we grew up and where we grew up and things like that, and how connected we are to those things that affect our maturing, and also affect like what we actually stand on and what is around us and things like that, and how big of a relationship we have to the land.
Okay, so for Erie, there's less like actual discussion of the location, like the country of Erie, and I didn't really want to describe rotten vegetables, especially because you might be eating while listening to this podcast. So it's more a description of the giant spren Kusikesh. So here we go. At precisely 7:46 in the morning, an enormous sea blue spren surged from the waters of the bay. It was translucent, and though it appeared to throw out waves as it rose, that was illusory. The actual surface of the bay wasn't disturbed. It takes the shape of a large jet of water. The center is of the deepest blue, like the ocean depths, though the outer edges are a lighter shade. Judging by the masts of the nearby ships, I'd say that the spren has grown to a height of at least 100 feet.
This is such an unusual description, because we're combining the description of like the ocean and like the water getting darker as it gets deeper with this description of height and 100 feet. Like, it's very intimidating and kind of baffling, because those are things that my brain doesn't know how to put together at all. So I think it succeeds at being very strange, even on this planet of, crabs. Like even in contrast to everything else, it's like, this is real weird.
Whenever I think of Kusagesh, I always think of the end of Princess Mononoke when the deer god, the head gets cut off and all the ooze comes out. And that's what I always think, that big giant creature when everything's oozing out. That's what I think Kusagesh kind of looks like. It's just this like giant like head thing coming out and trying to get at people. I don't know if that's very like religious or sacred or anything, but that's always what comes to mind, is just Princess Mononoke and the giant god dying.
I would give so much for a Studio Ghibli adaptation of Stormlight. Of course, they would destroy the plot because that's what they do, but the visuals would be beautiful.
Just don't give it to Goro, the son, because what he did to Ursi.
We didn't mention it in this section, but later, Axies is talking about how it's shifting through so many phases, and that reminded me of an Avatar: The Last Airbender episode, where like there is a spirit who steals people's faces and like rotates between them, and you're not supposed to look at it so it doesn't steal your face. So there's this like lingering part of me that's like, actually don't look at it, it'll steal your face kind of thing. But yeah, it's just very unusual and very different. I have so many questions about Kusagesh, but those are not going to get answered anytime soon. Especially because didn't they leave the planet?
Yes, they left the planet.
It's fine. Secret project.
That just reminds us though of the mystery or the sense of sacrality, where it's like we don't have to have these answers to sit in awe in relation to this really cool, interesting, magical thing. Like we can make an assumption that Brandon has reasons for all the things that are happening with it, because I think he's proven himself to generally have that. And it's just a nicer way to read him and read any book. But it's nice to kind of revel in that mystery, because I think there is a sense of sacrality that comes in reveling in the mystery, right? Not reveling as in like the colon are reveling, but enjoying the mystery, right? And living in that and being creative with it, right? Because it's like all of these connections that we're making to it are connections that you make when you have a relationship to the divine, right? How do you explain your moments when you have a metaphysical experience? You explain it through metaphor, you explain it through weirdness, you explain it through not as concrete words that we can get. And I think that is really brought out here when it comes to Kusagesh, right? It's this thing that we're going to know nothing about, but now we can like revel in that knowing nothing and create new things in that knowing nothing. And I think that's really something that's very beautiful.
I think also it's really interesting kind of with our cultural differences thing is Axies is here as an observer. He intentionally came here as an observer to observe Kusagesh. He is not here as like an Iriali who has a cultural and possibly emotional or divine attachment to this, what he is calling a spren and is probably not a spren. And so we have to read that connection into it, because Axies can't feel that connection the way an Iriali person might feel that connection. And like that is a thing that would be interesting to imagine, to see like, how could you, if I saw this being as divine or some level of divinity, a greater mystery, how would I respond to that and engage with that? Not as an observer like Axies, but as like congregant's not the right word, but as a member of that culture.
And I think that's one of the great uses of fantasy, modern fantasy literature, is in a culture where a lot of people are no longer believing members of a religion. You get a chance when you go into fantasy literature to experience what it would be like to be a believer, right? What would it be like to be in awe of something and have this mystical experience? And then later in, book 5, be called to leave the planet and get up and go. It's very much like what would the rapture be like? But you don't have to believe in the rapture or be Christian at all to have this experience. You can just read this fantasy book and experience what that might be like.
To people when they're sharing religious experiences, or when they're sharing those very personal experiences, not to just instantly say oh, you can't have had that magic miracle that happened to you, to like sit with that for a little bit and ask yourself, like, what would that feel like to have that experience as they are explaining it? Like, it may not scientifically have happened that way, or you can like explain it away in X, Y, and Z, but like just to sit with that for a little bit and enjoy that. It reminds me of when early in my first master's degree, I was studying medieval mystics and these women in the 1200s, 1300s who had divine dreams of Jesus, and that was how they gained religious authority. And I was talking to Barbara Zembalist, who was my professor for a class, and then I worked with her for a little bit as a research assistant. And she talked about how whenever she talked about female or any medieval mystic at any talk, everyone would always try to like ask, were they crazy? Were they schizophrenic? Were they that? And she'd always respond with, that's not a very interesting question to think through. Like, it doesn't matter. What matters is this person believed in that moment. And that's the more interesting approach to it. And I think, and especially in like our world where we've secularized a lot of people have kind of gone away from religion, although sociologically that's changing a little bit, right? But we need to sit with that a little bit more. What is it like for just to pull out the biggest example here, for President Trump to have that big spiritual experience of surviving a gunshot? Or what is it like for, in the Mormon context, for Joseph Smith to have knelt in a grove and experienced, different visions there? And not to just like explain it away, but to have a moment where you're like, yeah, what is that like? And can I have empathy to that? Can I have connection to that? Can I have, even if I am someone who was completely raised by like atheist professor parents who were super liberal, progressive people, whatever, right? Like, if I could have that, can I still, in a way, open up myself to understand at least, or to have some form of connection to this person's experience?
I think the way that like I often imagine like a secular version of like that mystic awe kind of is like space. And like seeing images, especially from like the James Webb Telescope, and like the way that I saw people reacting to Project Artemis, and like kind of all the like conversation around Artemis and the people's experiences on the flight. It was like a secular version of this mystic awe of like, there's this thing that is so unfathomable, like, I can't fathom going into space. That feels unfathomable to me personally. But not only that, but like these pictures are of light that is billions of years old, or like miles away. We could never reach it within our lifetime. And I think like if I was going to make a comparison to someone like listening who is like, I don't like, religion feels so far to reach for, to like try to make a comparison. Like that would be my like, okay, how do you feel when you think about space? Like, and I think for a lot of people that might be a good like starting spot of like, okay, maybe that's how I can see how people could talk about a religious experience, that kind of feeling of things, which I think we'll get to in our next episode a little bit more, with how Yasna and Shalon end up having discussions about feelings of faith, or in a couple of episodes. So, all right, our last passage is from Szeth's experience in Bavland, which, as a reminder, is a part of Yakoved. It's in the southwest corner of Yakoved, near the mountains. So, here on the outskirts of town, the ground was spotted with bulbous rock buds. As he passed, the plants rustled, pulling back their vines and lethargically closing their shells.
I'm going to highlight again the action of the Rosharan creatures, right? Lethargically closing their shells is a very agential type of description to the plants, right? It's giving them life. It's giving them conscience in some way, right? They're kind of choosing to close their shells slowly in some way. Not like entirely, right? They don't have like thoughts. They can't talk. But like in that same way that it's like the stubbornly refusing to withdraw, you have Szeth now, thinking through and realizing the liveliness of the creatures on the other side of the Misted Mountains here, which I think is, it's always like nice when you're finally able to like understand and see somewhat through someone else's culture or through a different perspective, right? And I think that's what some of Szeth's storyline gets us to, right? Is coming to terms with that very high end religious zealous background that then is meeting something very, very different, right? It reminds me always so much of just like whenever a 18-year-old Mormon from Utah goes on a mission to like Japan or something, and it's like, I know nothing about Japanese, and this is like dropped into the culture. And that's what I think a lot about Szeth's experience, right? Is having that relationship and growing to love and growing to experience and growing to have an intimate relationship with a different culture in many ways. It can overstep itself to being like, I now claim this culture for my own, which comes out in like the Book of Mormon musical when they all sing like, I am Africa, right? And they're all these like white boys who are like, just singing around. But like, I think like Szeth's approach here is something there. It's like, he's becoming human in a way that he had to move his space. And so he's now coming to understand and growing more into where he's at.
The other thing that is coming from this passage for me is just like this view of ruralness of Roshar, and more of, because a lot of the locations we're in Kolinar and Kharbranth, where things are highly built up, and we're in, buildings a lot. Same with Dalinar, even though it's the war camps, a lot of the time he's dealing with human-made structures. And even Kaladin in the war camps is just it's very human-made, and here you feel kind of like what Roshar feels like when it's not a city, when it's got some space, and it's giving me the vibes of like Southern Utah, frankly, because we know that is one of the influences for the Shattered Plains and stuff, but like this like scrubby kind of ecology that to us maybe doesn't feel very vibrant and green, but like actually functions and has its own ecosystem going on, even though it appears kind of desolate from our perspective as readers. And so we're seeing that like, oh, it's just, an empty ground with rock buds. Do they look like rocks? Are they green? I have no idea exactly what rock buds look like. How rocky are they, right? We will leave it to the Apple TV show to show us how rocky they look like. But the difference between like knowing an ecology and recognizing that like it is active and there's stuff going on here versus feeling like, oh, it's desolate, it's a desert.
I think that goes back to our cultural differences conversation again of like what you see from a culture when you're engaged in it versus what you see from a culture when you're just observing it and unwilling to engage with it, like is very different what you can get from your understanding. Like you were talking about with like a desert, you might be like, well, there's no ecosystem here. We should make everything green and lush here because that's the better way to do it. When it's like, no, there's a reason for deserts. There's a reason that there is an ecology for the desert that's just as vital and important as like a rainforest or a, deciduous area or whatever. And like, if we're engaging with the cultures instead of just saying, well, it's a desert, there's nothing there to be gained from it, then we're missing out on what can be gained from it, and like either something we can bring back into our own culture or just, appreciation of the desert. I don't really like living in a desert. I don't want to live in a desert, or like I don't want to live in southern Utah personally. That's way too hot and too dry and too everything for me personally. But I wouldn't mind visiting it and observing it and enjoying it and then coming back home and having had that appreciative experience. Okay, so we are going to conclude with our Wisdom of the Herald, where we each share something that we want to try to take back into our lives at the conclusion of this episode.
Well, having just come back from Southern Utah on my vacation, I'm kind of feeling the pull of all the things we talked about how landscape influences culture. And I've had this essay in my mind for a long time, wanting to talk about like what happens to you as a person growing up in Utah and feeling this like mountainous landscape around you in this bowl and valley. So I'm going to take another stab at that this week. I've tried several times and this essay has never come together. So it's something I am working on and thinking about how the landscape that I grew up in influenced me.
I grew up partly in the Provo area, and you have that very jagged mountain area right behind BYU, right? And I always think about how that's like my backbone, how that's the thing that I always feel comfortable being like pushed up against or something, right? And always like having something, and being on the East Coast now, like I don't have my little mountains around me. I'm so uncomfortable. So I am looking forward to reading that essay. I want to take into my life a more questioning approach to other people when it comes to their culture and just like learning more from other people. Because I think sometimes we don't take the time to slow down and ask someone like, where did that come from? Why do you do that weird thing? And not in like a attackive way, right? Like, why are you doing this? More of a just like investigative, a more interested, right? Just to learn more about someone else and about where they're coming from and what affected them in their life, and having more of that sense of being able to reflect with someone and able to also share more of where I come from and where I reflect from. Whenever I'm teaching class, I always call it I'm dropping atom lore whenever I talk about like BYU or something. And then all my students finally figure out that I teach, or that I'm not going to teach there. I went there, right? And they're all like, Secret Lives of Mormon Wives instantly comes up and all these things. But it's like, it's so much more. And it does affect me. It does affect how I talk. It does affect how I approach things. And I think it's always important to have that in mind and to be able to like think through that, but also be able to like talk about that and be able to turn those experiences into words like you're doing with your essay, Liz, or turn those experiences into words that can communicate that to other people so that someone else can know what culture you're coming from. Because I think one thing that's missing from these interludes is that a reflection in that moment, right? Like if Rysn had been able to talk, and Rysn and Vistim were able to talk to the farmer and ask a little bit more questions, they would have been able to learn a little bit more and been corrected on certain things. If Szeth could ask more questions, if Axies had asked questions of the Ariali, maybe he would have understood more about Kusakesh and things like that. And so I think like for me, I want to ask more questions about where people are coming from.
I've had like a reading list for a while, but like I don't consult it very frequently. But when I first put it together, I was like, okay, let's like have this very diverse reading list of a bunch of different perspectives. And then I never consulted it because reading new books is really hard for me. But I do think I want to try to like, I'm not going to say set a goal, but I want to integrate more books from other perspectives into my like reading rotation, like more new books in general, but also potentially like if I am reading a book by an author who has a very different background from me, looking into, has that author like done any interviews where they talk about how their personal experience interacted, like shaped how they wrote the book or what they were writing? Because I share a very similar background to Brandon Sanderson, and so it's very easy for me to see where he's coming from on a lot of his writing. But these other writers, I'm not going to understand why they wrote the way they wrote without understanding a little bit more about their cultural background and their understanding. So I want to try to do that more as I try to add some more new books into my Sanderson rereads and my other rereads of comfort books.
Thank you for joining us today on The Storming Journey. You can support our work on this podcast by subscribing to our Patreon, leaving a review, or sharing the podcast with a friend. We hope you'll join us next week, and in the meantime, remember, journey before destination.